Hello again, viewers. This is Angela Murjani from Kasturba Gandhi College in Hyderabad, and I welcome you to this second session on the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. I trust that you are really looking forward to find out what's going to happen on this journey that the poet has taken us along with her. We learned in the first episode that Emily Dickinson had a very small social circle and that she deliberately restricted herself to a very tight circle of close friends and family. Besides that, she was not even married. So all the extra time that she had on hand, she spent in isolation reading extensively. Many authors had an influence upon her, but most prominent of those who influenced her were the metaphysical poets Elizabeth and Robert Browning, John Keats, and from the side of her parents' religious orientation, she was strongly influenced by the Bible and in particular the book of Revelation. You will now hear a reading of the poem again, and this is just to refresh your memories about what we did in the previous episode. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing green. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. We had just stopped at that part where Emily Dickinson talked about children playing in their recess time. And now we're going to move on to lines 11 and 12. We passed the fields of gazing green, we passed the setting sun. You will notice that Emily Dickinson is talking about the fields of gazing green as if they were people. Once more, she's making use of that poetic device called the personification, and she's personifying the grain. Now, we often hear about the ripened grain and the top part of that ripened grain as a head. So probably she's assimilating that into the metaphor and saying that the grain that was ripened stood and stared as the carriage that was being driven by death and which was carrying the poet and immortality passed by. Now this was a very solemn moment, so it seems natural that all the grain on the field should stop whatever they were doing for that moment and watch as this very unusual scene unfurled before them. In this second scene that the poet is setting for us, we have not only the gazing grain but fields and a setting sun. Now, you would imagine that the setting sun has a lot of symbolic significance. First of all, we often talk about people in the latter years of their life as being in the sunset years. Have you heard that expression before? I'm sure you have. Or alternatively, sometimes people may talk of older ones as entering into their twilight years. So you can see that the setting sun signifies not just the end of the day, but also more importantly, it can sometimes stand for the end of a lifetime. So the setting sun assumes a lot of importance in this particular stanza. We can see that with the descent of the sun, there is also another descent happening, and that is the descent of the poet from life into death. So all these things are being brought together in a symbolic fashion by the poet in these particular lines. Together with the children mentioned in lines 9 and 10, the fields, the gazing grain and the setting sun, Emily Dickinson is creating a scene of the whole gamut of life's experiences in this particular quatrain. The children represent the early years of human life, the ripened grain represent adulthood, and the setting sun obviously stands for old age. So by including these three images in this quatrain, Emily Dickinson is representing the entire gamut or range of lifetime experiences that she is passing through as she moves in this journey from life towards death. You would have noticed in this particular stanza the repetition of the phrase "we passed." There is "we passed the children," "we passed the grain," "we passed the setting sun." Now this is a poetic device that poets make use of known as anaphora. Anaphora is used by poets in order to show progression. In this particular instance, it's something like the swish of traffic that you might hear if you were standing at a bus stop on the side of a highway and vehicles passed by one after the other. So you would hear swish, 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 and that gives you a sense of movement. So that is what Emily Dickinson is trying to achieve by the repetition of this phrase. We get into the poem, as it were, and we almost feel the movement. We know that the poet is not static in the carriage along with death and immortality, but there is a movement happening and we become automatically involved in that movement through the use of the anaphora, which is "we passed, we passed, we passed." So it gives us a sense also of building suspense that in passing, 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 very shortly there is going to be an arriving. But where is the poet going to arrive? And that's the question that's holding us at this moment in a great amount of anticipation. We now move into the fourth stanza and line 13, which says, "Or rather, he passed us." Now you will notice a distinct shift. In the previous line, the poet spoke of passing the sun, but now personifying the sun again, because she says he, giving him the qualities of a man, she says he passed us. So there is a distinct shift happening between stanzas 3 and 4, and that's what we want to take notice of in this particular explanation. Now, in a very real sense, the sun has passed the poet by, because if you look at what the sun represents, the sun stands for warmth, for light, and for life, and now the poet says the sun has passed her by, which very literally tells us that whatever the sun stands for is no longer applying to her life. And in a very clear way, she's telling us that she's moving from the realm of life into the realm of death. In making use of that small phrase, "or rather," not only does Emily Dickinson indicate to us a shift in what is happening in the poem, but she's also indicating a shift in her own perception, that from now on, it's not so much what was involved in life that she's going to talk about, but rather what's about to happen to her in the new phase that she's entering into. Lines 14 to 16. "The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle." Now, from these lines, what you see is what you normally expect from death. We all associate coldness, dew and chill with death. So it's definitely something that has changed, that has taken place in the lines before and the lines right now, because now the poet is beginning to associate those things that we normally think of when we speak of death. Her gown, she says, was gossamer. Gossamer is a very thin and delicate fabric, and it's something that is traditionally used to make the gown of a bride. A tippet is a kind of a cape that was traditionally worn by nuns. Now, maybe you know or maybe you don't Nuns are people who consecrate their life to the service of God, and they never marry. They stay single all of their lives. So in a sense, they are married, but they are married to God. They never marry a human person. Now, a tippet is something that nuns wear, like a cape around their shoulders, but the tippet which the poet is wearing in this scene is not like the tippet of nuns, because theirs would be of cloth, but her tippet is made of tulle. Tulle is a very thin fabric, something like net or gauze or lace. So although it is a tippet, it's a different kind of a tippet. This part of the poem lends itself to the explanation that because of the strong biblical influence on Emily Dickinson, and particularly because she was very fascinated by the book of Revelations, this particular stanza is related to her belief structure and the hope that she held in the promises that are recorded in the book of Revelations. Now, the book of Revelations says that those people who believe in Christ, when they die, they go on into a place where they will be united with Christ in a kind of a wedding. It's not the kind of wedding as we understand it between a man and a wife, but marriage is here used as a symbol of the most intimate and the most perfect kind of union. And we can get hints and clues that this is what Emily Dickinson was thinking about because of her use of the garments of gossamer, the veil of tulle, and the tippet, because all of these come together to indicate that in death she was going to another place, but she was dressed as a bride. And so we can kind of put two and two together and figure out that the fact that she never felt fear, she never felt intimidated by death, there was no dread and there was no sadness, which are the emotions that normally are associated with death. This is because she was looking forward to the marriage supper. This is what the book of Revelations talks about. In biblical imagery, garments stand for salvation and righteousness. Now, salvation simply means to be saved from evil, to be protected from the bad things which are out there, and righteousness means to be in correct standing. Now, when a bride in the Christian context wears a white gown and comes to be wed to her groom, in effect, what she's telling him is that she has maintained herself as pure and giving herself to him in marriage. Now it becomes his responsibility to protect her and to see that she's safe from all the evils out there. So she comes in right standing in her white garments. So white takes on a great deal of significance when we see that the poet is wearing white and it appears like she's wearing a wedding gown. And we also know from the biography of Emily Dickinson that she almost always wore white all her life. So putting all of these things together, we can now understand that this to her is an anticipation. This particular journey is taking her forward to something that she's been looking forward to, and it is that marriage supper that has been spoken of in the book of Revelations. Now the stanza also tells us that she's beginning to feel chilly, which again indicates that probably the garments that she's wearing, made of lace and net and tulle, are responsible. And we may think, oh, she should have been better clothed. Well, that is precisely the point. The poet is trying to tell us that she feels unprepared to face Christ in that marriage supper. However much preparation we might do to stand before God and meet with our Maker, I can only guess that it would never seem enough. So in telling us that the garments seemed inadequate because they were making her feel chill, the poet is trying to tell us that she is at this moment feeling a kind of unpreparedness. She's not quite sure whether she's going to come through with that required amount of righteousness that is needed in order to stand before her Maker. Stanza 5 we are about to embark upon now, lines 17 and 18. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. From the beginning, it has seemed fairly clear to us where the poet is headed. But right now, if we had any doubts at all, every one of those doubts will be cleared, because it seems quite certain that the carriage has brought her to the point and the place of her death. Is she scared? Does she want to stop and turn and run away? Oh no, she seems very calm, very collected, very cool and ready for whatever is going to happen in the near future. The words "we paused" in line 17 mark the second time that the poet and the carriage have stopped. Right way back in line 1, that was the first stop, when the carriage stopped to pick her up. And now this is the second stop. If that was the beginning of her journey, we can safely assume that now this is the end of her journey. She has come full circle in this journey, and now we are about to see what's going to happen next. The poet uses the word house, which is a very comfortable word for all of us. In fact, we associate many good memories with our house. And this in poetry is called a euphemism. A euphemism is a word that we use to decrease the harshness of a word which could feel very strong and hurtful. For example, in the papers, when you look at that obituary page, very often you might notice that people give the pictures of those who have died, and they don't simply say he died. They say he has gone to his heavenly abode, or they say promoted to glory. What they're doing is they are using a euphemism. A euphemism is when you find a kind and a gentle way to say something which might otherwise sound very harsh. So when the poet says that she reached her house, what she's talking about is not just a house that you live in, but apparently it is her grave. But she doesn't use that word because that word has many other meanings which are scary and frightening to most people. Lines 19 and 20. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. These lines, together with swelling in the ground in the previous line, together confirm that indeed the poet is now reaching her burial place. The cornice is something which is at the top of the wall which supports the roof and just below the roof. It's normally a kind of a design that people put there in order to hide any ugly things which might be happening in that point where the roof meets the wall of a room. Maybe there's electrical wiring and so on hidden behind that cornice. So if the cornice is below the ground, then you can imagine where the rest of the house is. Obviously, there's no part of it that is above the ground. Yet we can feel the peace and calm of the poet through all of this. Even though she sees that the cornice is way down below the level of the floor, she is not in any haste to escape from this situation. Stanza 6, lines 21 and 22. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. What did she say? Centuries have passed? So all this while we've been listening to a speaker who has been dead for a long, long time? This is very interesting. I don't know how many of you have ever been spoken to by someone who's been dead for many, many years. But right now, today, you are hearing from someone who has indeed been dead for many centuries. When the poet says that it feels shorter than a day, what she's simply trying to say is that the memory of it is so fresh in her mind that it is as if it just happened to her very recently. She can remember all the details of that particular event very vividly. They're all there at the top of her mind. Now, this is very much like what we experience in our city of Hyderabad, where time really has not much significance. In our city, people will say everything happened parsoon, which means just day before yesterday. Apparently, one visitor to the Charminar, which is a building that's over 400 years old, was told that this building was put up just parsoon, or day before yesterday. So for some people, time does not have the same relevance as it does to others, and there is a reason for this. Sometimes we are very stressed about the passage of time when we have much to do, but sometimes we are very laid back and so we perceive time differently. Lines 23 and 24. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. This final stanza is full of surprises for the reader. First of all, we've just found out that the poet has been dead for many centuries and she has been speaking to us all along. And now we find out that the horses have been heading towards eternity, pushing in that direction right from the very beginning of the poem. These final lines take us full circle because they bring us back to the opening lines when the poet found out right there that this was a different kind of a carriage. If you remember, she used the capital C to indicate that this was a special kind of carriage, and we talked about it being a hearse or a death chariot way back in that line. Now the poet finds out that these horses were different too, and these horses were horses that were heading out towards eternity all along. These were not just your regular horses, but in some important and significant way, these horses were linked to her journey into the afterlife. The use of eternity in this stanza also helps us to see that the journey has kind of reached its completion. In the circumstance of eternity, time loses all of its meaning, and that's the reason why the poet is probably at such a slow pace and so calm and so unstressed. You see, when we are not in eternity, we are within the framework of time, and a lot of the stress of our lives comes from this very tight framework of having to accomplish so much and do so many things within a span of 24 hours. Now, for example, if you have an assignment that you have to submit by this weekend, then you know that you have only 7 days in which to do it. So the stress builds up. Or if you are a working person, you have some other job to accomplish by the end of this very day, and the stress builds up even further. But if you were in eternity, where there is no constraint of time at all, where there is no 24 hours, there is no week, month or year, then you have eternity, which means forever and forever, to do whatever you must do. And that would definitely lend us a feeling of being slow-paced. It would take all the stress out of whatever we're doing. And so in bringing eternity into this last stanza, this is what the poet is trying to give us a feel of, this never-ending time, this no constraint kind of realm, this particular part of her life or phase of her life when she doesn't have to do anything within a time-bound framework. She has all of eternity to do whatever she must do. And so the poem ends in such a way, again, drifting into eternity. It ends in a way kind of leaving us at a loose end where there is so much time that we get a feeling of the whole poem just trailing off. The overall theme of the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, seems to be that death is an inevitable part of our lives and that we need to confront it and to see it as a part of nature and the cycle of life. However, we must admit that it's a different take on death. This is not the kind of poem that poets normally write about death. It views death quite differently. We could probably find two different sources for this new perspective on death that comes from Emily Dickinson. One possibly could be her lifestyle of isolation. Having lived as an introvert, never mingling with people, never having much social intercourse, maybe these thoughts that came to her were constantly on death. This can happen to people who live far from social interaction. They can enter into depression and much of their thought life can be spent upon thinking about death and thoughts related to death. So that could be one aspect of it. And the other aspect, of course, was her very religious upbringing. In fact, her parents had migrated from England to the United States just in order to enjoy religious freedom. So Emily Dickinson was brought up in a very orthodox Puritan Christian home. But being somewhat different herself, she did not subscribe to all the ideology that her parents held dear and sacred. Perhaps when she talked about her garments being inadequate, what she meant at that point and juncture of the poem was that all of her ideology was not the same as her parents. So in that moment of death, she was afraid of whether she was going to fall short or whether her own belief structure would be enough to support her into that wedding banquet of the Lamb that she was anticipating. On the whole, the view that comes through that Emily Dickinson held on death was a very optimistic one. She portrays death as something to be looked forward to, something that you definitely don't fear, something that you don't feel sorrowful about, you don't tremble about it, but rather you go into it with a feeling of hopefulness, looking forward to what is in store for you in eternity. This is a very different view from what we normally see that poets hold. Emily Dickinson's poems have been studied extensively by critics, and many critics have pointed out inconsistencies of style and form in her poetry. However, one thing that they have not been able to deny is the definite power of her work, and in the fact that it causes people to think and provokes them into discussion and argument. This one thing alone can probably explain the enduring popularity of her work through the ages. Emily Dickinson still remains one of America's most beloved poets.